Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Before we begin today, like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Join our growing international community. Embassy evacuations, cyber attacks, sanctions, and general pressure is what is being marked in the developments of the Russo-Ukrainian crisis. Yesterday, we covered how Russia had pretty much taken out what is an essential and legal invasion of the territory of Ukraine, following Vladimir Putin's recognition of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the Donbass area. This was shortly followed by the Russian legislative body allowing Vladimir Putin the authorization to send Russian soldiers into these areas. Now, it has been assumed by the West and other satellite images and the statements of separatist leaders in Donetsk and Luhansk have shown that Russian soldiers are probably already in the territory. And as mentioned in our report yesterday, Donbass, even though two territories are essentially being controlled by rebels, is still part of the territory of Ukraine, the internationally recognized territory of an internationally recognized independent nation. Now, it should be noted that, as we did state yesterday, for months, the West has stated that if Russia carries out an invasion of Ukraine, that it would begin to levy massive sanctions against the nation. And so it has, but the sanctions have not been nearly as massive as they were before threatened. Notably, for those that remember, what has been going on is that the United States, its Western allies, the European Union, have stated that if Russia were to carry out an invasion of Ukraine, they would introduce crippling economic sanctions that would completely destroy the economy of Russia. Now, so far, the sanctions introduced by the United States and the European Union have only targeted Vladimir Putin himself, the 351 legislative members of Russia's legislative branch, the upper and lower houses, which voted in favor of allowing Vladimir Putin military authorization to enter Ukraine, 27 top government officials, business executives, and military officers, and other banks and various Russian companies. Now, this is a good first step, but in order for the West to be able to completely deter Russia, the massive sanctions, which had talked about removing Russia's ability to be able to make foreign transactions with the United States dollar or the European Union euro, or completely shutting off the Russian banking system from foreign banking systems, while also introducing massive economic blockades, need to be done. The reality is that Vladimir Putin has not, or Russia, has not just sent soldiers into Donbass. The recognition that the president of Russia, Putin, issued when recognizing the territories, the separatist territories of Donetsk and Luhansk, is much larger in scope than what is already controlled by the rebels, notably encompassing the city of Mariupol, which is a very important port to the Azov Sea. Now, it is clear that Russia has more territorial ambitions to expand in Ukraine and expand as much as it potentially can. And the reality is that the West has been restrictive and kind of laid back on introducing extremely massive sanctions because it wants to see what Russia is doing next. But that is a mistake. The reality is that large, massive sanctions that have been thrown against the Russian Federation would actually make a difference. Now, sanctions typically, historically, have not had major effects. If anything, they have been counterproductive and led to conflict. But the reality is that sanctions that have been talked about being introduced by the United States, by the European Union, by the US and its NATO allies would actually be so crippling to Russia that it would have to do something. But the reality is that Russia has historically demonstrated that as a federation, it is able to withstand sanctions and mitigate their effects. Now, what this means is that Russia cannot be expected to change its fundamental foreign policy or national interest of having influence in Ukraine and adding the nation to its geopolitical sphere of influence in Eastern and eventually Central Europe. That cannot be expected to change just because of sanctions. But the reality is that if sanctions are levied now as a deterrence to force or pressure to prevent any further actions by Russia on the territorial and sovereign integrity of Ukraine, they might just work. Now, they're obviously not going to be a solution. These sanctions need to be followed through by dialogue. Now, Vladimir Putin has proposed a solution that would completely end this conflict. And this has come with 3 new demands coming from the Russian president, all of which are extreme. Demand number 1 is that Ukraine recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, the 2 separatist territories which it has been fighting a war with in eastern Ukraine in the Donbas area for the past 8 years. This war has cost a total of 14,000 lives, roughly speaking. Now, Ukraine is not going to want to do this. Maybe eventually down the road with some form of diplomatic dialogue, but it would be losing another major chunk of its territory. Now, in addition to the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk, Russia wants Ukraine to also recognize Crimea as a part of Russia. So Ukraine, just off the bat, based on Vladimir Putin's demands, is losing a major portion of its eastern territory, which is an industrial and economically important heartland for the country, and Crimea, which is a fundamentally militarily strategic and important peninsula in the Black Sea of Ukraine's territory. Now, the second demand of Russia is one of the demands it's been making since the beginning of this crisis, which has been that that Ukraine be permanently banned and barred from entering the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, this demand actually makes sense from Russia's perspective. Having a country, another nation so close to Russia's borders, and one as large as Ukraine, and one that Russia has an inherent conflict and territorial disagreement with, is a threat to Russia's national security and foreign policy interests. The reality is that if Ukraine was a member of NATO right now, we would not be talking about just sanctions. There would be United States, German, French, and other NATO soldiers already in Ukraine getting ready to fight Russia. This is not something that's in anyone's interest because a military intervention would lead to a world war. Nonetheless, this is not in Ukraine's interest because one of Ukraine's main foreign policy goals is to eventually join, 1, both the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the European Union, and 2, to generally become a westernized country. You cannot expect this to come from Ukraine. Now, the final demand of Vladimir Putin is probably the most humiliating and extreme one, which has been the demilitarization of Ukraine. I can tell you right now that Ukraine is not going to agree with this. The reality is that Ukraine is constantly under the threat of Russia. Even if this conflict gets resolved in the short term, Ukraine is always going to be under the threat of Russia. A potential Russian invasion or Russian attack or Russian encroachment on Ukrainians' territory is always going to come, no matter who the Russian leader is. This is not a unique stance from Vladimir Putin. This is a Russian foreign policy interest. Ukraine inherently needs to maintain a strong, developed, and active military to be able to defend its own national and territorial integrity. Ukraine's not going to agree with this. These demands that have been made by Putin are typically the kind of demands made in potential treaties that are signed between a victorious power and a defeated power following a war. Vladimir Putin is acting as if he has already won some form of war against Ukraine. Now, tensions are increasing. This has not boiled over into a war yet, but a Russian invasion has occurred, and Russia has crossed the red line that has been established by the Western community. And that is why sanctions have been levied against the country. Now, today, major developments have occurred. Russia has completely evacuated its diplomatic presence in Ukraine, notably removing its ambassadors and staff from the embassy in Kyiv, and other diplomatic councils and buildings have been completely evacuated of Russian personnel. Ukraine itself has removed its ambassador from Moscow, while also stating to Ukrainian citizens to not travel to Russia, and for those who already are in Russia, to get the fuck out of there, because fundamentally Moscow and Russia's aggressions against Ukraine are going to make consular services, things like getting passports, receiving help to get out of the country, or kind of any other kind of service you expect a diplomatic entity to do for its own citizens, are going to either be impossible or reduced by Ukraine because of the increasing tensions. Now, notably, we reported last week how denial of service attacks had been carried out on Ukrainian banks and government institutions. Much more have been carried out today, targeting the Ukrainian police targeting the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Interior, various other Ukrainian banks, private and large businesses, and the general cabinet ministers and their websites. Now, whether or not these denial of service attacks are actually coming from Russia is hard and difficult and almost impossible to prove, but where else are they coming from? Ukraine's not going to do this on itself. I mean, eventually it could to gain more international support, but fundamentally, Ukraine already has this international support. The crisis is continuing. Russia has already made an invasion, as we reported on yesterday, into Ukraine. Russia has removed its diplomatic presence from the country. That is not to say that diplomatic ties between Ukraine and Russia have been completely cut off, and that is crucial to follow. If ties are cut off between Ukraine and Russia, resolving the situation is going to become much more difficult. Now, as I've stated, my personal belief is that this conflict can only be resolved through the West enforcing massive sanctions on Russia now and not waiting for Russia to carry out more invasions or more territorial attacks against the integrity of Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying that this is eventually going to lead to war. These sanctions must be met with a continuing dialogue. World leaders and NATO leaders who are invested in the sovereignty of Ukraine should continue some form of dialogue with Russia to meet its security demands to some form of reasonable level and find a negotiation that can resolve this conflict. Now, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has again called to have a meeting between himself and Russian head of state and government Vladimir Putin. Now, this has not happened for the past few months. Russia, the Kremlin, and Vladimir Putin's government have completely brushed off and refused to meet with Zelensky. But the reality is that is eventually going to have to happen. Now, previously, this conflict was essentially just between the United States, its NATO allies, and Russia. It had not entered Ukraine's territory. But now, the crisis is even intimately more in bed and tied to Ukraine itself. The solution that's going to be found to these problems is now much more complicated and is going to have to be twofold, both on a global and geopolitical level between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and Russia, and between Ukraine and Russia itself. The demands being made by Putin are extreme, and I don't expect any Ukrainian leader to accept them. Even if they were pro-Russian, demilitarization of Ukraine is one really extreme thing to do. Now, we're going to see how things develop. But again, the solution to this is sanctions and dialogue. But let me know if you agree with me. Let me know what you think. Let me know in the comments and let's have a discussion to see what's actually going on and see what kind of ideas people have out there. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you tomorrow.